Hello, my name's Jamie Cawthra and I work with Stephen Holland at the Department of Philosophy at the University of York. And the research that Stephen and I do is on a subject which has been brought more and more into public attention by the current coronavirus pandemic. Let me tell you about why. Because you might have seen on the news recently that the government's track and trace app has been going through various trials and tribulations. In fact, the big news at the moment is that the government switched from third-party infrastructure to the more familiar Google-Apple infrastructure. And the big reason why is that there were lots and lots of privacy concerns about the previous iteration of the app. And let me remind you what the app does if you're unfamiliar with it or if you've forgotten. The idea is this uses the Bluetooth connection between smartphones to keep track of all the different people who you've come into close contact with during the pandemic. The idea being that if you or one of those people come down with the coronavirus, then everyone will be able to be notified very quickly and you'll be able to go into self-isolation to stop the spread of the disease. But that's a pretty sensitive piece of information, a list of all the people you've been close to. You could use that to track where someone's been for the last month, for future months, for as long as the pandemic lasts. So if that raises your hackles a little bit, if you don't really want that list being kept by the government, then you're not alone. And that's the reason why the government has switched to Google Apple in the first place. To quote from the BBC News reporting on this subject, the Apple-Google design has been promoted as being more privacy-focused. However, it means epidemiologists will have access to less data. That's one of the things that Stephen and I are really interested in. This kind of spectrum we find, where on the one end, data, personal data, sensitive personal data, can be extremely useful. It's got very high utility. And in fact, we can see pretty clearly why epidemiologists having this kind of sensitive data is a really good thing. It helps contain, curtail, and eradicate the coronavirus. But on the other end of that spectrum, we have very legitimate concerns about people's privacy. So it seems like the less privacy people have in this instance, then the more data the epidemiologists have to work with to try and control the coronavirus. So where does this fall? Where on that spectrum should we draw the line and say we've hit the right balance of privacy and utility? Let me talk about something that sounds initially completely unconnected. Because the other day, my brother was helping my grandmother with her car insurance. And if that sounds boring to you, trust me, it was fairly boring for me at the time as well. So my brother sat there with my granny's complete financial information, all of her birth records, all of this stuff. While she sits, more than 2 meters away, I promise, going on the phone to her car insurers, registering him as able to act on her behalf, to review and to sign contracts for her. Now, my granny wasn't demanding that this process be decentralised and that her privacy be more respected. She was entirely happy to completely blow away her privacy in favour of the utility of my brother helping her out with her car insurance. Now, why is that? Why was she happy to do that when individuals are much less happy to sign away their privacy in exchange for the promise of a more effective controlling of the coronavirus? We think the big difference here is that my grandmother trusts my brother. Now, what is trust? It's usually seen as this really intimate person-to-person relation between families, family members, or really, really close friends. And as part of this relationship of trust, my granny doesn't feel the need to put in any kind of oversight mechanism or safeguards or security features in my brother's managing of her personal data. She wasn't asking me to sit there with an eye on him, making sure that he didn't do anything sneaky. In fact, if she had asked me to do that, I think we'd be pretty well justified in saying that shows that she didn't trust my brother to act on her best interests. So maybe what this actually shows is that the public don't trust Baroness Harding, or the government's track and trace initiative, or even the government itself. And in fact, one of the things that Stephen and I are most interested in is whether it's actually possible for the public to trust institutions, particularly public health institutions, that use their data in the first place. Now, the big question then is, what does it mean to trust somebody? And are the typical markers of the trust that we find between people like my grandmother and my brother even able to be found in relationships between, say, you and the NHS? We think there are two big markers of trusting relationships between individuals, and we can take those markers and see if they also apply to relationships between individuals and public health institutions. So the first big marker we've identified is that when you trust someone, you see them as having a particular set of values that align with yours. So take my granny and my brother. My grandmother values not getting fleeced by her insurance company, and she believes, wholeheartedly I hope, that my brother genuinely himself values her not being taken advantage of. So their sets of values work in nice harmony together. So we can take that marker, value congruence, and ask, do we have value congruence with public health institutions, or, in the example that we're using here, with the track and trace organisation? Well, what sort of values might track and trace have? Hopefully, their big value is the swift elimination of the coronavirus. That seems to be a value that, again, hopefully, meshes well with the values of individual members of the public. Now, the problem here is a lot of people aren't going to be completely convinced that that's the only value track and trace has. That the violations of privacy, the sheer amounts of data, can also be used for the ends of values that we don't share, perhaps more draconian public policies on keeping tabs on civilians. So, it seems that feasibly the government can have a set of values which gel nicely with our own. And if that's true, if the government has values in the first place, if values aren't just something that only individual people can have, then perhaps there can be a sense of public trust in the track and trace initiative, and would be more willing to let them use this kind of data to achieve the values that we think are important. What's the second marker of trust? We think it's vulnerability to betrayal. Now, betrayal is a pretty extreme and unique concept. Not just everything counts as an act of betrayal. If you're in whichever your favourite coffee shop happens to be, you've ordered a latte and they bring you a cappuccino, you don't immediately declare that you have been betrayed. You might stop buying your coffee there. In fact, you might just get over it and move on with your day. But even in cases of much more important, life-changing, even life-threatening things, we still don't think that these are instances of betrayal. So if your cake maker for your wedding includes peanuts in the cake that you're allergic to, well, that's a huge sort of gross professional violation. But it's not a betrayal. If the undertaker drops the casket, that's not a betrayal. And you might be pretty well licensed to not use the services of these people again. You might even recommend to your friends that they avoid using their services too. But they haven't betrayed you. Compare to if my brother had decided to use my grandmother's financial information to skim a little bit off the top, to take some for himself. If he had done that, then I think would be extremely well justified in claiming that he had betrayed my grandmother, that he had abused the trust that she had put in him. Now let's compare that with track and trace. The track and trace went out as a trial run on the Isle of Wight. 60,000 people downloaded it. It's just over half the population of the island. Now, were these people making themselves vulnerable to betrayal in the process? Yeah, I think they were. I think it's pretty easy to imagine the headline, "Government betrays population of Isle of Wight." So again, it seems like it's possible for there to be a relationship of trust between individual people and organisations responsible for the use of medical data. Now the big question is, does the public trust these public health institutions. And given that the government were forced to move the infrastructure of their app from third party to Apple, Google, it seems like the answer is no. Which leads us on to a whole host of other really interesting philosophical questions that we don't have time to talk about now. So, for example, where is the right place to draw the line between utility and privacy? What actually is privacy, and what makes privacy so important? What can the government do? What can public health institutions do to make themselves more trustworthy, to earn the trust of the public, to get to the point, like my grandmother and my brother, where we think, no, they will genuinely use this data to benefit our interests? But if you want to find out some of our answers to that, you're going to have to keep an eye on the department's research output. Until then, we hope you're staying safe. We hope you've enjoyed this video. Bye.